but she really wanted to go, and so I relented, and we left. We had a great time, and spent nearly the whole weekend on the beach, sipping tropical drinks and just breathing in the ocean air. When we got home, though, both of us nearly had heart attacks when we saw our backyard. Our fence along the side of the yard that we shared with Ralph was knocked over, and all the plants between the fence and our pool were ripped out and scattered around the yard. And I don't know how they did it, but they emptied our pool and filled it with garbage. It smelled so bad that I nearly vomited. I was so angry that went out into the garage and was going to get my baseball bat and do something with it when my wife stepped in front of me and told me to calm down. Hi there, my name is Anthony, and I had the worst possible neighbor you could imagine. Now, I may have gone a bit overboard with getting retaliation. I'm usually a very calm and easygoing person, but I was pushed beyond my limits. Here, let me explain what happened, and then you'll understand what I mean. I have been living in the same house for over a decade now, and about 6 years ago, my neighbor Ralph and his family moved into the house next door. Ralph and I got along fairly well, but his teenage sons Bobby and Teddy were very unruly. They would constantly do crazy things like ride their bikes through my front yard and rip up my yard. That, or they would have pool parties with a bunch of their friends and would drink even though they were underage. There was one party in particular where they had over 24 people over and partied until 5 in the morning. They were being so loud that I got nearly no sleep at all. I was tempted to call the police, but I chose to speak with Ralph and maybe appeal to his good nature. I figured that if I called the police that it might just make for some bad blood between our families, and rather than poking that bear. I waited until Ralph came back so I could speak with him. Hey there, Ralph. I hate to be that kind of neighbor, but your sons went a bit overboard the other night.
Yeah, they made quite a mess. I guess they were just blowing off some steam.
Okay, but I had to work the next day, and they kept me awake the whole night. And they made a mess on my side of the fence even.
Well, yeah, you know how it is. Boys will be boys.
Ralph, with all due respect, that really isn't good enough. There were dozens of beer cans in my yard and they got sick in my bushes. Ralph, can you please have a word with them and try to get them not to be so rowdy next time?
Honestly, they really weren't that bad. Maybe you should just not be such a stick in the mud and just mind your own business.
His responses were not even remotely acceptable, but all I could do was hope that he would see reason, and that if the boys had another party, that they would be more aware of not being so loud the next time, at the very least. Sadly, that wasn't the case. Literally a month later, Ralph and his wife left to go away for a weekend, and I knew that his sons would definitely have a party that night. As the day went on, Ralph's sons' friends began to show up. My wife and I were swimming in our own pool in our backyard, when suddenly some teenage boys were leering over the fence at my wife and calling her all kinds of lewd names. Wow, check out the body on her.
Yeah, she's my type for sure. Hey there, beautiful. Why don't you come over here and have a drink with us?
Yeah, wow. Maybe you could take your top off at the very least. Both my wife and I were disgusted, and so we went inside. We figured that, at the very least, it would be quieter, and with any luck, that later, closer to bedtime, that they would quiet down. As midnight came around, though, they were extremely loud. Once again, I was tempted to call the police, but didn't until 1 a.m. when we heard people in our backyard. There were so many people next door that several of them spilled over into our yard and were swimming in it. As soon as I saw them in my pool, that was the last straw. I called the police right away, and a few minutes later they showed up. When the sirens and lights were going off, the teenagers dispersed and ran in dozens of directions, and the police gave chase. A few minutes later, it was quiet, and my wife and I breathed a heavy sigh of relief. In the morning, we went outside and found our backyard a complete mess. There were bags of garbage in our pool and beer cans everywhere. A large word was carved into the hood of our car that read, "Snitch." It was carved with keys, I think. When Ralph came back, I stormed over and told him that he needed to do something about his sons, or else I would call the police on them from now on. It was not well received. "Ralph, this has got to stop. Your sons are out of control."
I don't care what they did. How dare you call the police on them? My boys spent the night in jail because of you.
As they should. They are underage, drinking, and they trespassed onto my property and were swimming in my pool. They even left garbage in it and keyed my car. Ralph, how dare you defend them?
I don't give a damn about your car. I demand you apologize for getting them arrested.
Both of us were seeing red, and before I knew it, We were shoving one another, and then Ralph threw the first punch, and we were on the ground rolling around, punching and kicking one another. Our wives had to pull us away from one another in order to get us to stop. We were like animals. Months passed, though, without incident. I could only assume that Bobby and Teddy were laying low so that they wouldn't get in trouble from the police. But I also knew that it was only a matter of time before Ralph left once again for a weekend away and the boys would misbehave. However, nothing happened, and my wife and I thought that maybe the last party had been just what was needed to get some sense into those boys' heads. On a whim, my wife suggested that maybe we should go away for a weekend. I was hesitant, but she really wanted to go, and so I relented, and we left. We had a great time, and spent nearly the whole weekend on the beach, sipping tropical drinks and just breathing in the ocean air. When we got home, though, both of us nearly had heart attacks when we saw our backyard. Our fence along the side of the yard that we shared with Ralph was knocked over, and all the plants between the fence and our pool were ripped out and scattered around the yard. And I don't know how they did it, but they emptied our pool and filled it with garbage. It smelled so bad that I nearly vomited. I was so angry that went out into the garage and was going to get my baseball bat and do something with it when my wife stepped in front of me and told me to calm down. We ended up calling the police, but when they came out, they told us that there wasn't anything that they could do as there were no witnesses. They simply couldn't prove who it was that had done the damage and vandalism. It was then that I planned out my revenge. I went and got a bunch of supplies that I would need for my plan, and I waited until Ralph would go away. I didn't have to wait long, and as soon as I saw him pull out of his driveway and drive off, I went into action. Ralph always left very early in the morning for his weekend trips, while his sons always slept in nearly to noon. And so I used the morning to set up my revenge as quietly as I could. I had bought a liquid blue dye that I added to their pool in enough quantities that it wouldn't be obvious that it was there until someone jumped into the pool. I then snuck into their house through the back door and dumped rotten eggs throughout the house. I had been saving them in my garage in an airtight container and with my nose plugged and a mask on. I hid them throughout Ralph's house. I honestly don't know how Robbie and Teddy slept through it, but I got in and out without them noticing, and then I disposed of supplies I used and sat back in my own backyard and waited. After a couple hours, the two boys ran out of the house desperately gagging and looking for fresh air. Neither knew what was wrong with their house, but they weren't going to let a smelly house ruin their party, and so they called up their friends and told them to still come over. Once there were about a dozen people, they all jumped into the pool and began splashing around. As soon as I knew they were in the pool, I snuck around to the front of the house and removed the valve stems from every tire of every car in the driveway, flattening all of the tires, and then went back inside my house to watch the carnage unfold. It didn't take long for people to realize that the pool was turning their skin blue, and while some tried to rush into the house to wash it off, others tried to go to their cars to drive home and wash it off there. Those that ran inside quickly ran right back out, and those that had tried to use their cars were also frustrated, and they returned to stand by the pool. None of them knew what to do, and as the sun set, none of them had come up with a plan. They ended up sleeping in the backyard that night, but the kicker was that around 10 at night, a wild thunderstorm rolled in and drenched all of them in cold rain. By the time the morning came, there were dozens of blue teenagers that sat around Ralph's pool crying and miserable and unsure what to do. It was then that Ralph came home, and he and his wife saw all the cars in their driveway and went around out back to see why the party was still going. The boys told them everything that had happened, and Ralph knew instantly that I had a hand in it, and so he called the police. Much like I had experienced, though, they told him that there wasn't anything that they could do as there were no witnesses. 2 days later, there was a for sale sign on their front yard. I heard through other neighbors that they had tried to get rid of the rotten egg smell, but couldn't. They had even hired professional cleaners, and they could not get rid of the smell. They really didn't have much of a choice, and so they chose to sell. After a couple of weeks, they found a buyer, but because of the smell, they lost a lot of money on the sale. The new owner had pretty much given them less than half of what the house was actually worth, and so they moved away. Bobby and Teddy were both stained blue from head to toe for months on end. I know this because I saw them more than once completely blue. Ralph and his wife ended up buying a house on the opposite side of town, and I was very happy. We passed by each other from time to time, But thankfully, I never had to deal with Ralph or his sons ever again. So maybe I went a bit too far, but after what they had put us through. I'm just grateful that they caved in and sold their house as quickly as they did. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment down below saying I subscribed, and we will try our best to reply to your comment.